It turns out that women might have power to make their voices heard in a way that hurts men a lot more than just by protesting in the streets. And that's Under the Sheets. Up next at 9 on CNN. On May 2nd, 2022, Politico leaked documents that said that the Supreme Court appeared to plan to overturn Roe v. Wade. Of course, given more recent developments, that's old news by this point. But amidst the many angry reactions to this news, one of these reactions is actually still of relevance now. Of course, it flew under the radar at the time, but it's funny that it did, because it came from one of the most popular talk shows on television, whatever you might personally think about it, The View. The View is a show where a half dozen or so women go on air to discuss so-called hot topics, ranging from politics to pop culture, whatever. It's mainly a middle-aged woman kind of thing, so not really my purview, but one thing that Joe Behar, the show's longest commentator, said following the Politico leak is actually pretty intriguing.
Women in the world have conducted sex strikes in history. In 2003, a sex strike helped to end Liberia's brutal civil war, and the woman who started it was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2009, Kenyan women enforced a sex ban until political infighting ceased. Within 1 week, there was a stable government. Okay, so we have more power than we think we have, and some of it could be right in the bedroom.
The response to Behar's idea was mostly that of lukewarm, half-hearted derision from people on the right, and almost no real reaction at all from anyone on the left. But what no one seemed to point out is that, while Behar may have called for a sex strike specifically in reaction to the Supreme Court's impending ruling restricting abortion, in actuality there seems to already be one going on for a good while. I used to use the dating app Bumble quite a lot. I was kind of addicted to it, if I'm being honest. One thing you'd fairly commonly see was women saying, "No conservatives," or "If you love Trump, swipe left." I would say one in about every 15 to 20 women would say something along these lines. In the meantime, even though my political affiliation was listed as being on the left on Bumble, I matched with conservatives, moderates, apolitical people, roughly about as often as I did with liberals. In fact, I even matched with your mom. If you're watching this, Janet, I hope you're doing well, love. Kisses. All this time, I didn't see a single moderate that said moderates only. I didn't see apolitical girls who said apolitical partners only. I almost never saw even a single conservative that said if you're a liberal, swipe left. Maybe like 4 or 5 times ever, as opposed to, countless times I saw left-leaning women say something along those lines. Even one of the former directors of CPAC, also known as the Conservative Political Action Committee, says she doesn't discriminate when it comes to her partner or political beliefs. Of course, unsurprisingly, the author of the article goes on to deride left-leaning women for refusing to date conservatives while arguing for the banner of open-mindedness, as if conservatives not being able to get laid is somehow the fault of the woke, close-minded left. Obviously, this is total bullshit. Left-leaning people, and women especially, are not wrong for not wanting to date people of a political party that openly and clearly wants to restrict the rights of women. And sure, whatever, if that's what you want to believe, but the polls as a whole back up what I've seen on Bumble and show the exact opposite is actually the reality. According to a 2020 Pew poll, 27% of Democrats said they probably wouldn't consider being in a committed relationship with a Trump voter, and 45% said they definitely wouldn't, a total of 71% of Democrats. In contrast, 47% of Republicans definitely or probably wouldn't date a Clinton voter, and only 24% of Republicans said they definitely or probably wouldn't date a Democrat. According to another 2020 Pew poll, 56% of women identify as Democrats, and only 38% of women identify as Republican. But is of course rather weirdly not taken into account in the first poll are casual rather than committed relationships. The poll also fails to mention gender identity when it comes to politics dating choices. However, another poll from Axios did at least take gender into account, finding that 41% of women would date someone from the opposing party, as opposed to 67% of men. Even though the parties of those women in this poll is still left out of the picture, we know from the previous poll that most of those women are probably Democrats. As such, it's clear that conservatives, and especially conservative men specifically, have a big disadvantage when it comes to dating someone of an opposite political affiliation. I really struggled with how to frame this video because as a guy, I don't want to be the one advocating for what women should do with their own bodies, especially at a time when women are losing more and more control over their bodies. But as it seems to be the case both historically and in the current time, I'm going to frame this video mostly from the perspective of women doing a sex strike. But again, this doesn't mean men or non-binary people or anyone, however they identify, can't play something of a role as well. The idea of the sex strike dates actually far further back than Joy Behar mentioned, all the way back to at least Greek times. In Aristophanes' Greek comedy Lysistrata, I hope I'm saying that right, a woman of that same name, Lysistrata, decides to organize a sex strike among the other women of Greece, on both sides of the conflict in order to stop the carnage of the Peloponnesian War. But Lysistrata's plan ends up backfiring, and rather than help bring an end to the war, withholding sex only inflames the two sides, who blame one another for their newfound lack of Greeky freaky time. Not only that, but many of Lysistrata's comrades become desperate for sex, and begin to desert with rather lame excuses, like one lady who says that she needs to do her laundry. Of course, she really just says that in order to get some Hellenistically good dick. Eventually, however, delegates of both sides arrive, with quote, large burdens under their robes, as in fact they are actually rock hard, and I'm not talking about the Medusa kind of rock hard, and agree to finally end the war. In other words, the Spartans and Athenians were so horny that they literally ended a war for sex. Of course, this was just a fictional play, and a satire at that. The real question is whether this strategy is actually effective in the real world. Men generally care about almost nothing more than sex, so it's hard to think that this won't have some effect. But is that effect positive or negative? Was Aristophanes right? Is horniness really the key to the victory of the proletariat? My research first brought me to Kira Cochrane's article, Do Sex Strikes Ever Work? It's only a few hundred words long, but boy are those few hundred words a doozy. Kira Cochrane starts the article off fine as she talks about various examples of sex strikes throughout history. As she writes, in Prairie, Columbia, in 2006, the girlfriends of gang members held a widely publicized strike of crossed legs, vowing to give up sex until their partners gave up violence. Last year, the city's murder rate saw the steepest decline in Colombia, down by 26.5%. Then in Naples, Italy in 2008, women formed a similar strike against the notoriously dangerous New Year's fireworks displays. But in 2011, yet another man died and 70 people were injured at the event. Was one strike a long-term success, one not? It's impossible to say. Okay, so first of all, I'm very confused by the fact that the author asks whether one strike was a success and the other wasn't. Based on what she says here, the first seems to have been a success and the other seems to have failed. I think that's fairly evident, but alright, let's move on. These aren't, thankfully, the only measures to have been taken against these issues, Cochrane goes on to write. Of course, she then goes on to talk about, indeed, the exact same measure, which is a sex strike, so I'm not sure what that sentence is supposed to mean. As she writes, one sex strike lauded as a straightforward triumph was held in Kenya in 2009, when women's organizations protested against political infighting. After just 1 week, there was a stable government. Alright, so she gave very little details here, but looking further into the sex strike in Kenya, it was in protest against infighting between the two main leaders in Kenya, and after a week, the two leaders agreed to cooperate. So it seemed like that actually worked. Again, so we have two seeming successes and one seeming failure that have been pointed out in this article alone. So what, you might ask, is Cochrane's ultimate conclusion? Cochrane ends her article by writing, so are sex strikes the way forward? It seems unlikely. While it's understandable that women might assert political power this way, and a form of sexual control too, in communities where they're marginalized, sex strikes are also clearly problematic, asserting old ideas of men as sexually predatory and essentially entitled to sex, while women must protect their honor at all costs, and can only change effect through their bodies. Back to the debating chamber, I'm afraid. Back to the debating chamber. In a couple hundred words, she goes from basically outright stating that sex strikes seem to work fairly well to enact political change, to telling the reader we have to go back to the drawing board because apparently it reinforces the stereotype that women can only affect change to their bodies. Who is saying that women can only affect change through their bodies? And how exactly does a sex strike assert the idea of men as predatory and entitled to sex? By withholding sex from men, wouldn't you basically be showing that men aren't entitled to sex? I could go on and on about the run-on sentence and all that, but whatever. I'm not here to just shit on some random lady who writes for The Guardian, but think for a moment that someone got paid to write this article for one of the biggest news organizations in the UK. Just like how the idea of a sex strike only gets a 30-second discussion on The View before it's quickly laughed off, it speaks to me to just how profoundly unserious many major outlets see the idea of sex strikes, even among women. Putting aside this article though, we can see other examples of the success of sex strikes. Joy Behar also mentions Liberia on The View, and indeed Liberia might be the most significant example of a sex strike in history. Sex strikes in Liberia were part of a massive and eventually successful campaign in Liberia against a 13-year-long civil war. As Leymah Gbowee, one of the main organizers of the sex strike and the Nobel Peace Prize winner that Joy Behar mentioned, said, "We felt like the men in our society were really not taking a stand. They were either fighters or they were very silent and accepting all of the violence that was being thrown at us as a nation. So we decided we'll do this sex strike to kind of propel the silent men into action." So if you had a beer buddy who was a warlord, imagine having a beer buddy who is also a warlord, you needed to encourage him to lay down his arms. And the way we were trying to do that was to pressurize the partners that we had, husbands and partners who were also sometimes silent in the entire scheme of the war. Of course, the women's activism also involved other forms of protest, like stage sit-ins and mass demonstrations, directly contradicting Cochrane's smear of sex strikes as something that enforces the stereotype that women can only enforce change through their bodies. There are other potential examples of the sex strike's success as well. In 2011 in the Philippines, women of a small village enacted a sex strike which apparently helped bring peace between the two villages. Also in 2011, women in Colombia, inspired by the same closed legs movement in 2006, started a sex strike to pressure the government to repair the road connecting the town of Barbocas to its neighboring towns and cities. After a strike that apparently lasted 211 days, in October 2011, the Colombian government finally promised action on road repairs and construction ensued. Of course, one of the problems with these accounts is that it's hard to say how many women actually stick to this kind of sex strike. I mean, did hundreds of women in Colombia really refuse to sexually satisfy their partners in any way for over 200 days? Did the sex strike in all these cases go beyond just not providing sex and also being emotionally distant? And what constitutes sex? Are kisses allowed? What about oral sex? Probably in part due to how taboo discussion of sex is in many cultures, there seems to always be frustratingly little details in terms of what a sex strike is actually supposed to entail. But regardless of the actual parameters, it does still seem to have the potential to bring results. Of course, what probably differentiates the country's current sex strike from just about any other example is that it is not based on any one single issue, but as the Pew polls show, it's a broader stand by a very large portion of the population against any and all conservatives, especially anyone who supports Trump. And also, while most other sex strikes tend to be shorter, with the exception of the one in Colombia in 2011, the one currently going on in America seems to be a years-long, if not potentially lifelong, revolt. Of course, one might think a sex strike would never work in the long term thanks to the fact that women are, let's be completely honest here, nearly as horny as men are. But women are not boycotting all men and thus depriving themselves of their own sexual satisfaction like the women in Lysistrata are, but simply those men who support causes they are against. Of course, the question remains as to whether such a strike actually has the potential to bring about change in the way these more short-term strikes do. Does love trump all? Or, to put it perhaps better, does love trump Trump? I think going back to the impending repeal of abortion rights is very relevant in this situation. As lines like this highlighted one from Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the recent decision overturning Roe v. Wade show, the pro-life movement has never been about caring about the lives of fetuses, at least not for conservative politicians. The anti-abortion movement serves two purposes for them. Firstly, convincing one-issue voters to vote for them, and secondly, for controlling women's bodies and forcing them to do one of the few things that conservatives actually value women for: bearing children. Thus, it's safe to say that the idea of a mass movement of women withholding sex actually does terrify conservatives because it flies in the face of the fundamental purpose for which women to them exist in the first place, as vessels to produce children. With this in mind, might a sex strike potentially contribute to fomenting radicalization among impressionable young men and not only inflame existing incels but quite literally create more of them? Potentially. But what is the alternative exactly? That we give every incel a beautiful, big titty goth girlfriend?
I've said it once, and I will say it again. A chicken in every pot, and a woman for every single last incel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. In all seriousness, it's easy to see how conservative punditry could weaponize a movement like this to call for things like enforced monogamy. But then again, they're kind of already doing that anyway.
We would be happier. Every person in the dating scene right now would be happier if they were just matched up with someone against their will. Actually.
But while the sex strike might have inevitable downsides, sex strikes still might also have the potential to prevent people from falling down that rabbit hole in the first place. After all, many incels believe that women choose men mainly based on genetic traits like having lots of muscles or strong chins, etc., etc. Therefore, a movement of women withholding sex from men based not on how a guy looks, but instead based on political beliefs, might actually serve to sway some people away from the incel crowd by making them have hope. Perhaps they could be swayed to believe that they aren't doomed to never get laid because of bad genetics, but simply because of their distasteful beliefs. Which is, as the studies shown earlier prove, at least to some extent true. I also think just as important for people willing to use the withholding of sex as activism is to follow the example of other sex strikes throughout history, and not only do so when finding partners, but with a partner you're actually already with. Like perhaps if you have a boyfriend that is anti-abortion rights, don't have sex with them. If you have a girlfriend who is, anti-trans rights, don't have sex with them. I'm not demanding anyone do this, obviously. I know that this might cause a huge amount of emotional toll. I know that might just not be an option. It's just an idea. My point is that a person in a close and intimate relationship with another person probably has more sway over that person's action than any person ever would have with a stranger. Ultimately, given that so much goes into influencing one's political beliefs, it's difficult to measure what the ramifications of our nation's ongoing and growing sex strike have been, or what they might be in the future. What's sad to me is that there doesn't even seem to be a serious conversation. Whereas people in developing countries are willing to make sacrifices that are unimaginable to us in the first world, the idea that a sex strike here is either played for a joke or dismissed outright in the first world just shows the sheer amount of privilege that we have. Oh, sorry everyone, I think that's your sister calling me. So I think I'm just gonna wrap it up here. In any case, remember to keep up the good work, ladies. And fellas, just remember, stay woke. Coming, babe!